They thought the sun had risen twice. On a clear morning over the Pacific, a second sun was born, brighter than anything humanity had ever seen. But this sun did not warm. It burned. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the sky over Hiroshima exploded with blinding light. In a fraction of a second, that light turned houses, bridges, bodies, and even shadows into one endless storm of fire and dust. 3 days later, on August 9th, another sun flared over Nagasaki. Two brief flashes of light. Two acts that ended the deadliest war in human history and began a new age, the nuclear era. People still argue about why it happened. Was it vengeance for Pearl Harbor, Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. base in 1941? Or a cold, calculated move, a political and military decision meant to force Japan's surrender without invasion and to show the world the power of American science? The truth, as always, is more complex. To understand those two flashes, we have to go back to a world still at war, unaware that humanity was about to harness the power of the sun itself. By spring 1945, World War II was nearing its end. Germany had fallen. Hitler was dead. But across the Pacific, Japan still fought on. The emperor's army refused to surrender. Every island, every village became a fortress. The Americans had seen how costly invasion could be. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had claimed tens of thousands of lives. Generals knew that invading Japan's home islands would come at a staggering price, up to 1 million Allied casualties and millions more Japanese dead. Then, in the quiet of secret laboratories in New Mexico, something was born that promised to end the war in an instant. The Manhattan Project, a massive scientific effort uniting thousands of scientists, engineers, and soldiers. They were building a weapon based on the very fabric of matter itself. When atoms split, they released the same energy that powers the sun. By summer 1945, as Allied leaders met in Potsdam to discuss the post-war world, President Harry Truman received the message. The test was successful. The power of the atom can be controlled. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of Alamogordo, the first man-made dawn lit up the sky. Codename Trinity. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the elite 509th Composite Group, didn't yet know he would be the one to deliver the new weapon. But soon, that order would come. Secrecy was absolute. On Tinian Island, deep in the Pacific behind barbed wire, a special fleet of aircraft was being prepared, modified B-29 superfortresses built to carry atomic bombs. Inside the 509th Group, everyone worked tirelessly. Engineers, pilots, mechanics, armorers, each doing their part, most of them unaware of the weapon's true nature. Only a few knew they were preparing not just an explosive, but the end of an era. When Enola Gay took off from Tinian and Boxcar followed 3 days later, none of their crews fully understood what their mission would mean. In their hands was not just a weapon, it was a man-made sun. 43 seconds after release, the first bomb would change the world forever. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, remembered J. Robert Oppenheimer, quoting an ancient Hindu text. He knew that humanity had crossed a line, one where science and conscience could never again be separated. Two suns, two symbols of the end of the old world. They ended one war and began a colder one. To understand how humanity reached that moment, we must start at the beginning, from Pearl Harbor to the final flight over Hiroshima. Why did a morning that began with clear skies and the peaceful sound of ship horns become the moment the world began its countdown to the atomic age? December 7th, 1941. In the quiet waters of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, Sunday started like any other. Sailors dried their uniforms. Officers prepared for the coming week. The air smelled of salt and engine oil. No one knew that within minutes, that calm would be shattered by the roar of Japanese aircraft engines. At 7:48 a.m., the first planes appeared over the harbor, their wings marked with red circles, the rising sun. 353 Japanese planes, launched from 6 aircraft carriers, descended upon the Pacific Fleet. In just 90 minutes, America lost 8 battleships, more than 200 planes, and nearly 3,000 lives. The United States awoke, quite literally, to the sound of explosions and burning steel. What Japan saw as a preemptive strike, America saw as a national humiliation. Pearl Harbor became more than a place. It became a symbol. Newspapers screamed, "Remember December 7th," a headline that turned into a vow. A wave of anger swept through the nation, along with a single purpose: to destroy the enemy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, a date which will live in infamy. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan. The global conflict that had seemed distant now became America's own. But behind the emotion came calculation. In the White House, at the Pentagon, and in the shipyards of San Diego, the machinery of total war began to turn. Within months, American carriers were steaming across the Pacific. What followed was a long, brutal chess game played across water and islands: the Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima. Each name marked another step closer to Japan itself. By 1944, the U.S. controlled most of the Pacific, but Japan refused to yield. Kamikaze pilots turned themselves into human weapons. Soldiers fought to the last man. For them, surrender meant dishonor. In Washington, American strategists began to calculate the cost of a full invasion, and the numbers were horrifying: millions of casualties on both sides. Every island taught the same grim lesson: Japan would never surrender easily. And so, within the depths of America's war machine, a new path to victory began to form, a path led by science. But what if Pearl Harbor had never happened? What if Americans had never experienced that sudden, devastating strike? Would President Truman have had the moral justification to use the ultimate weapon if the war hadn't begun with such humiliation? Those questions are not rhetorical. Pearl Harbor became the emotional foundation for everything that followed. The memory of that morning endured all the way to August 1945, when the crews of Enola Gay and Boxcar prepared for their missions 3.5 years later. No one used the word revenge in their briefings. But every man who had fought in the Pacific remembered Pearl Harbor: the explosions, the smoke, the helpless ships. That memory became the silent note beneath the symphony of their mission. Pearl Harbor was not the answer. It was the reason. America entered the war not for vengeance, but to prove a point. It would never again be caught off guard. And that determination, that fear of another humiliation, drove the nation to create a weapon no one else could match. The next step is to understand how that weapon was born, who built it, what it cost, and what moral lines were crossed to create a sun inside a bottle. What could make thousands of scientists and engineers rush to turn atomic theory into a machine of death? And who first managed to pack the sun into a bomb? The Manhattan Project wasn't a single lab. It was a nationwide enterprise. Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and dozens of satellite plants and facilities. It began with alarm. In 1939-1940, physicists were whispering about the possibility of a chain reaction. Letters from Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein pushed President Roosevelt to act. The race for the atom became scientific, industrial, and military at once. It was not enough to understand the physics. The nation had to build massive production lines for enriched uranium, to manufacture plutonium, to design detonators, and to retrofit aircraft to carry a weapon no one had ever carried before. 3 technological tracks turned the project from theory into reality. First, enriching uranium-235. At Oak Ridge, they ran multiple methods: electromagnetic separators, gaseous diffusion, and early centrifuges. Thousands of machines running day and night to produce enough highly enriched uranium. Second, producing plutonium at the Hanford reactors. Graphite reactors irradiated uranium slugs, and nearby chemical plants chemically separated out plutonium, the material suited for implosion designs. Third, Los Alamos, the brain trust. Under J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientists were building bomb designs timing systems, and safety procedures. Two basic design solutions defined the bombs that would later be ordered into service. Little Boy used a gun-type design. Two subcritical masses of uranium, 235, were driven together down a barrel to form a supercritical assembly. The idea was straightforward and reliable, which is why it was chosen first, but it required a large supply of enriched uranium, the hardest resource to make. Fat Man was an implosion-type plutonium bomb. Explosive charges arranged around a plutonium core used shaped charges, explosive lenses, that, when fired in perfect synchrony, generated a symmetrical shock wave to compress the core into a supercritical state. That approach demanded invention and extreme precision. Synchronized detonators, complex explosive lens geometries, and a dependable neutron initiator. The engineering challenges were enormous. Fat Man required dozens of detonators to fire at once with microsecond accuracy. Little Boy needed a barrel and propellant system that would stay stable under the strains of flight and release. Engineers built custom machines. Physicists sketched dynamics on paper and in small-scale tests. Technicians assembled and tested prototypes under tight secrecy. The project cost billions in 1940s dollars and ran on strict discipline and extraordinary logistics. All of that work led to one decisive moment. The Trinity test on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert. The first controlled nuclear detonation proved that implosion worked. The human-made device could release energy on the scale of tens of kilotons. For many who were there, it was both a scientific triumph and a moral shock. The theory had become raw, terrible power, comparable in force to the sun. The Manhattan Project wasn't just a story of equations and experiments. It was an industrial revolution under military command. Factories, railways, and labs turned toward a single purpose. It converted intellect into ordnance and theory into geopolitical leverage. That same machine, honed by years of labor and failure, furnished the crews of Enola Gay and Boxcar with the weapons they would carry, the instruments that would translate calculated design into an act that changed the world. Next, we'll look closer at the people inside that machine. The scientists, the soldiers, and the moral compromises they faced as they turned the power of the atom into a practical weapon. Could one secret test change the course of world diplomacy? And did the words spoken at Potsdam set in motion the decision that led to two suns over Japan? The summer of 1945 was a time when the fate of the world was being shaped not only in conference halls, but also in desert laboratories. At the Potsdam Conference, July 17th, August 2nd, the Allied leaders gathered to define the post-war world, reparations, borders, and spheres of influence. During those talks, President Harry Truman received a secret message. On July 16th, in New Mexico, the first atomic device had been successfully tested, Operation Trinity. That message shifted the balance of power in the room with Churchill and Stalin. 10 days after the test, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, July 26, 1945, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction should it refuse. The phrase was more than a public threat. It was a diplomatic signal, a subtle show of the power now in American hands. Military planners and advisors debated several options: a demonstration of force, a test over an uninhabited area, witnessed by observers, a strike on a purely military target, or a direct attack on a city to force Japan's immediate surrender. The arguments for and against each option blended cold calculation with moral uncertainty. The decisive factor was the projected cost of invasion. Operation Downfall, which could have resulted in hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of casualties on both sides. Those numbers were cited again and again as justification for using the new weapon to avoid an even greater loss of life. Another key factor was the Soviet Union. Stalin was present at Potsdam, but the USSR had not yet entered the war against Japan. When Truman cautiously informed him of the successful Trinity test, the message was received in silence. Yet within weeks, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. For Washington, The timing was crucial. America's leaders knew that the bomb could serve not only to end the war quickly, but also to limit Soviet expansion in the post-war Pacific. Potsdam became the crossroads of science, strategy, and diplomacy. The secret success in the desert gave the United States a new kind of leverage. The Potsdam Declaration delivered an ultimatum. The fear of catastrophic invasion losses and the desire to check Soviet influence in Asia combined to form the political and military context in which the use of atomic weapons seemed, to some, a necessary means to end the war quickly. But one question remained, then and now. Does the end of a war ever justify the price paid in civilian lives? That question has haunted history ever since. Some thought choosing a city was strategy. In truth, it was the geometry of apocalypse: blast radius, block density, wind direction. On the table lay a map of Japan, and every red circle marked not just a target, but a future that might still be altered. After Potsdam, U.S. headquarters moved into a new phase, the applied phase of the atomic decision. The question was no longer whether to use the weapon, but where precisely to use it. The Target Committee, meeting in Los Alamos and Washington, developed strict, rational criteria. 1. Military significance. The city should host strategic targets, command centers, supply depots, transport hubs. 2. Intactness. The area should be relatively undamaged by previous raids, so the effects of a new weapon could be clearly assessed. 3. Psychological impact. The target needed to be large enough to demonstrate power, but not so large that destruction would be perceived as mere slaughter. 4. Visibility for visual aiming. Success depended on weather, cloud cover, smoke, terrain. Pilots had to see the target with their own eyes, not rely on radar. The list narrowed to 4 cities: Kyoto, Hiroshima, Kokura, and Niigata. Nagasaki was added later. Each name on the map passed through debates where military terms mixed with words like ethics, history, and symbol. Kyoto, the ancient capital, was initially considered ideal, a major cultural center, largely untouched, with strategic value. But Secretary of War Henry Stimson insisted on its removal. He knew the city personally, admired its temples, and argued that destroying Kyoto would turn the war into an act of barbarism. It was a rare moment when human feeling overruled cold calculation. Hiroshima remained the primary target. Analysts marked its flat basin surrounded by hills, perfect for focusing a blast wave. Minimal prior damage. Headquarters of the Second Army. A communications hub. A population of over 300,000. Most important, clear aerial visibility. A memorandum dated July 25th recorded. Primary target, Hiroshima. Secondary, Kokura. Alternate, Nagasaki. Kokura's selection reflected its industrial role, an arsenal and a major torpedo factory. Nagasaki was added later, a port city with shipyards and docks, but with uneven terrain and often cloudy skies. At these meetings, notes already hinted at the research element of the strike. Physicists and analysts emphasized the importance of observing real effects: thermal pulse, radius of destruction, spread of fires. Everything was to be documented carefully. The bomb was not only a weapon, it was an experiment conducted at full urban scale. By the end of July, the coordinates were finalized. The flight crews of the future mission received instructions: visual aiming, radio silence until after release, and full documentation of the aftermath. 3 marks remained on the command map. One of them, Hiroshima, would soon become the symbol of an end and a beginning. The moment when humans learned to pick targets with an accuracy that left little room for error. The island looked tiny and forgotten on maps of the Pacific, and yet it became the nerve from which the fates of millions trembled. If Potsdam gave the order, Tinian turned that order into a weapon. This was where the final stage of the plan was born, in hangars where they didn't just assemble planes and bombs, but the resolve that some would later call inevitability. On Tinian's northern tip, North Field, long concrete runways, hangars, and depots sprang up, and, in a matter of weeks, transformed this tropical strip into one of the most restricted and intense military zones on the planet. Tinian was a logistical marvel. Modified B-29 Silver Plate bombers were based there, bomb components arrived there, final assembly took place there, and from there routes stretched toward Japan like white threads of death across the ocean. Picture a night hangar, dim lights, mechanics in masks and goggles, and above them a huge aluminum fuselage. Inside, a charge would soon be hidden that could redraw the map of the world. What did that mean for the men who worked in those bays, doing hands-on work without fully understanding the scale of what they held in their hands? The base's operation rested on three interconnected pillars. First, infrastructure: long, reinforced runways, fuel depots, guarded transport corridors, and communications networks designed to allow no leaks. Second, manufacturing flow: the hurried but methodical final assembly of components in special hangars, testing of firing mechanisms and remote detonation systems, mounting and balancing bombs to meet B-29 specifications. Third, operational preparation: night training for crews, visual aiming drop simulations, studying weather patterns and wind corridors. All of it turning a plan on paper into a point on a map, and that point into a pilot's mission. And then, the route. Flight plans were not just lines from Tinian to Japan. They were paths of risk. Hours over the ocean in a vulnerable heavy bomber, complex turning points, visibility and weather constraints, and finally, the moment of truth, visual identification of the target, and the instant the crew makes the call that decides everything. Work on Tinian moved under a cloud of absolute secrecy. Radio silence, restricted access, relocation of civilian camps inland, all measures to reduce the chance of leaks. But in that silence, a particular psychology developed: the solitary importance of every detail. One loose bolt, one miswired connector, one improperly seated cover could turn the experiment into a catastrophe. Conversely, flawless control of each tiny element gave the team confidence that the mission would go as planned. By late July, Tinian had become a tense transport hub. Crews concentrated there, final weapon components arrived, last tests were run, and from there the Enola Gay would lift off. An island that once meant almost nothing was now at the epicenter of a decision that would either end a war or begin a new era of terror. When the lights in Tinian's hangars finally went out and a single airplane tore into the night, the world was already different, though no one yet knew how far the echo of that flight would reach. On paper, it was just a table of names and roles. In reality, it was a military mythology. Every person in the 509th Composite Group was both a professional and a judge of other people's lives. When these men rose from Tinian, their names remained in the logs, but the decisions they carried out echoed across continents. The 509th Composite Group was not an ordinary bomber unit. It was a closed, almost bespoke organization created specifically for the operation with a new weapon. At its core, command staff, 2 or 3 flight squadrons, a technical service, ordnance specialists, and a meteorology section. The mission required ritual-like precision: pilot and co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer/radio man, radar/EW specialist, and a unique role: the weaponeer, the officer in charge of the bomb itself. Each man carried his own short biography and his own responsibility. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the 509th and pilot of the Enola Gay, a decisive, pragmatic leader who preferred facts to feelings. Tibbets made key operational decisions: which aircraft to use, crew training, and the order of flights. He named the plane after his mother, a gesture that would later appear as an irrational contrast to the machine of death he piloted. Captain Robert A. Lewis, co-pilot of Enola Gay, Tibbets' closest companion in the cockpit. His hands held the control yoke in the moments when fate turned. His notes and memories form part of the mission's diary. In the cockpit, they acted as a single organism. Tibbets and Lewis, the two faces of one decision. Major Charles Sweeney, commander of the Boxcar crew, the plane that would later carry Fat Man to Nagasaki. Sweeney was an experienced aviator and strict commander. His role shows how each operation had a plan A and a plan B, men ready to assume the mission at any moment. Captain Thomas Farabee, bombardier of Enola Gay, the man whose aim determined precision of the drop. His training was metronomic. He counted seconds and pixels of Earth beneath him. It was the combination of technique and coolness that made the order executable with maximum effect. Captain Kermit Behan, bombardier for Sweeney's crew on the Nagasaki mission. Behan was regarded as one of the finest bombardiers of the war. In difficult terrain and weather, he demonstrated extraordinary accuracy, the skill needed in a backup scenario. Weaponeer William Deke Parsons, the man who stood at the intersection of science and practice. Parsons developed and supervised arming procedures, and he personally handled the preparation of Little Boy in flight, ensuring the firing mechanism would work as intended. His role was singular. Not merely an officer, but the trusted executor of explosive physics. Lieutenant Jacob Baser, radar and electronic warfare specialist, the only crew member to fly on both Enola Gay and Boxcar. His task was the security of electronic systems and navigation under potential interference. Imagine that fragile coordination: a navigator checking a chart, a bombardier holding the crosshairs, a weaponeer closing the final safety, and a pilot whose breath precedes the decision. Together, they were the machine that made an order into reality. These short biographies are not of men who ruled history, but of specialists, veterans who had fought across the Pacific, with countless hours on B-29s, training flights, and flawed night missions behind them. Their letters and post-war recollections are full of contradiction. Professional pride mingled with a later understanding of the scale of what they had done. When the crews climbed from Tinian, strategy and technique merged with personal responsibility. And at that point, history shows decisions are made and carried out by people with pasts, fears, and a tolerance for risk. It was this human network of characters and roles that turned targets on a map into real points on the surface of the Earth. On paper, there were just 4 aircraft listed among dozens of other B-29s on the Tinian flight roster. In fact, these 4 machines were part of the most exacting operation in history, where every rivet, every serial number, and every radio call were a measured step into a new age. In that moment, no one spoke of symbols, but later those names would become symbols. Enola Gay Boxcar, the great artiste, necessary evil. If the 509th Composite Group was a structure of living people, their tools were machines built for the impossible. All 4 B-29s belonged to the Silver Plate series, special modifications, lightened and adapted to carry atomic ordnance. Stripped of gun turrets, reinforced in key areas, fitted with a new bomb bay system. They looked standard, but every element of their design served one singular purpose: to deliver a cargo without parallel. Enola Gay B-29 S/N44 to 86,292, the carrier of Little Boy Star, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, who personally selected the aircraft at Wendover and named it after his mother. Inside, a modified bomb rack, a conditioning system to keep the firing mechanism stable, and an improved autopilot. On this airplane, every step of the procedure was rehearsed: navigation, release, and the escape turn. Enola Gay * became synonymous with the opening of the atomic age, not merely as an aircraft, but as a marker between one war and human history. Curiously, the crew did not know the exact nature of their load until almost the last minute. Orders used the phrase "special device." Only Tibbets and the weaponeer, Parsons, knew that the payload was an uranium bomb. For everyone else, it was simply a mission of special importance. Boxcar B-29 S/N44 to 27,297. The second carrier, the plane that would deliver Fat Man * to Nagasaki. Its commander was Major Charles Sweeney. The crew originally planned to fly the Great Artiste *, but instrumentation changes forced them to use the backup Boxcar Star. That substitution helps explain the chaos of August 9th. Fuel shortages, weather complications, and the one backup decision that determined the fate of tens of thousands. The Great Artiste B-29 S/N44 to 27,353. The the scientific aircraft fitted with instruments to measure pressure, radiation, and thermal impulse. Its role was not to attack, but to observe. The measurements it collected would later let scientists evaluate the weapon's effectiveness. In the Hiroshima mission, it flew near Enola Gay asterisk. In the Nagasaki operation, it accompanied Boxcar through much of the route. Necessary Evil, B-29 S/N44 to 86,291. The photo and documentation plane for the Hiroshima mission. Outfitted with high-resolution cameras and a reconnaissance team led by Captain George Marquardt. Its job was to record what no one should have to see. Photographs taken from its cameras became the first visual evidence of a force capable of vaporizing a city in minutes. These 4 aircraft were like 4 notes in a single score: carrier, backup, observer, and witness. Their synchronized departure, assigned altitudes, and enforced radio silence were timed to the second. But beneath the perfect plan lay a simple vulnerability. One engine failure, one gust of wind, and history might have moved in a very different direction. The Silver Plate program embodied a technical premonition of a new era. These were machines designed less for carpet bombing than for demonstrating technological supremacy. When Enola Gay asterisk lifted from the runway, she carried not only a weapon, but a concept. That victory could be measured not by counting soldiers, but by harnessing atomic energy. Today, those planes are gone, scrapped, retired, or placed in museums. Yet in every rivet and panel remained frozen the seconds when humanity first realized it could change the world with a single flight. The night before the mission smelled of kerosene and metal, and, more than that, of the unknown. On hangar tables, there were no escape plans. Only orders forbidding talk, final assembly, the last act before turning abstract strategy into a concrete explosion. What happened in those hours decided everything. Final assembly and pre-flight checks on Tinian were at once routine and sacred. Little boy asterisk and fat man asterisk, 2 different weapon concepts, were assembled in separate secured hangars under tight control. William Deke Parsons and his team of weaponeers coordinated the work. Scientific advisors and engineers from Los Alamos were present as needed, but access remained painfully limited. No publicity, no fuss. Only a sequence of operations many would later call the final act of a technological nightmare. Outside the hangar, life went on. Aircraft inspections, fuel depots, routine calls. Inside, there was a silence in which only the whisper of tools and occasional officer commands could be heard. Safety procedures were layered and strict. Roles were separated. Mechanics took responsibility for structural integrity. The weaponeer prepared the device and oversaw activation systems. Security officers guarded secrecy and access. Every operation was documented and cross-checked. One team performed an action, another verified it. Any anomaly meant a delay. Logs were signed, serial numbers recorded, and journals kept. More than bureaucracy, these were psychological safeguards against error. A critical element was arming and interlock checks. Each device had multiple safeties to prevent an accidental ground detonation. The mission required an in-flight arming procedure. Components of the firing chain remained safe until the aircraft reached a prescribed area. That task was performed by a designated weaponeer under exacting rules and the commander's supervision. Clearly and deliberately, final readiness occurred in the air, far from base and with minimal risk to ground crews. Picture the moment. Engines humming, the bomber climbing, and in the dim cockpit a single man performing the final act of trust between engineer and pilot, changing the device from safe to armed. No one spoke the weight of it aloud, but it was palpable. Crew briefings followed rehearsed scenarios. Target coordinates, alternates for cloud cover or system failures, radio silence rules, and emergency procedures for mechanical failure. The meteorological briefing was essential. Cloud layers, wind direction, and strength at bombing altitude could change the target or cancel the mission. Forecasters provided a set of maps for each possible time window, and crews trained to identify targets by visual markers. Technical checks included bomb bay balance, flight control tests, autopilot operation, and release mechanisms, all within tolerances that did not reveal the device's internal design. Logs recorded weight, center of gravity, and fuel reserves to avoid in-flight surprises. Any marginal parameter became a reason for adjustment or for substituting the aircraft. Psychological preparation was its own matter. Some mechanics stayed awake for days. Others cracked jokes to diffuse tension. Formal rituals were few, but many crews paused for a quiet prayer or a brief moment of silence before departure. They understood they were not carrying out an ordinary combat mission, but an act that would very likely be discussed for generations. By morning, everything was ready. Aircraft checked, bombs assembled in special enclosures, roles assigned, final signatures in place. Tinian, the operational artery, sent its sons into the sky, and the world took another uneasy step into a new age. When the last bolt was inspected and the final command given, only one thing remained: takeoff and the immediate encounter with the unknown. One plane carried the decision, a second counted the consequences, a third recorded the truth. When the 4 aircraft rose over the ocean, it was not merely a tight formation of metal and fuel. It was a living laboratory, each airplane assigned an irreplaceable role, and their synchronization would decide whether the event became just a report in an archive or the beginning of a new era. The H-mission route from Tinian to Japan was planned like a surgical operation, a precise track over the ocean, turning waypoints, corridors for entering the target airspace, and safe zones for return. The formation included specially chosen B-29s with distinct tasks: the strike plane, the instrumentation plane, and the photo/observer, plus discrete ground and air support from Tinian to the point where all systems were brought to final readiness. Enola Gay, the strike plane, the carrier of the device and the aircraft whose bombardier would make the final release decision based on visual identification. Enola Gay * led the formation and held the course to the aiming point. Her job was to enter the designated corridor, achieve visual identification, and execute a precisely timed release according to procedure. The Great Artiste, the instrumentation plane, fitted with sensors and instruments, it flew close to the strike plane or slightly aside to collect the physics of the event, recording the shock wave, pressure signatures, flash duration, and optical and radiation signals. Its instruments were the scientists' eyes and ears in real time. The data from Great Artiste * became the empirical basis for the first assessments of the weapon's effectiveness. Necessary Evil, the photo/observer. Equipped with large-format cameras and a reconnaissance team, led by a photographic officer, its task was to capture the moment of detonation and its visual consequences, mapping damage, sequencing fires, and watching cloud behavior. The photographs were critical evidence, visual verification used for both military reports and scientific analysis. Imagine the scene. For aircraft in formation like instruments in an orchestra, one note, the strike, a second, the recording, a third, the witness, each delay a risk of misinterpretation. Communications between the planes were minimal and tightly regulated. Radio silence held for most of the route. Data exchange relied on prearranged codes and visual signals. Visual confirmation of the target was central. The bombardier had to see the ground landmarks himself and confirm the target manually. Meanwhile, the instrumentation plane logged synchronous parameters, and the photo plane documented everything on film. If visual contact failed, contingency procedures were in place. Delay the drop until visibility improved or switch to a secondary target from the approved list. Support from Tinian included standby aircraft and ground services, weather and reconnaissance flights, fuel schedules for the return route, and backup planes for emergency assistance. Fighter escort was occasionally provisioned for protection against random air threats, but the mission's critical resource was timing: who saw what and when, which governed the chain of decisions. A single mistimed second could mean the photo plane missed the decisive frame. An offset in the instrumentation plane's position could leave an important pressure peak unrecorded. The mission's success determined not only tactical outcome, but the reliability of subsequent conclusions. This combination, striker, measurer, and witness, made the H mission both military operation and scientific experiment. It was not a routine raid. It was a staged act. Deliver the blow, measure its force, and record its sight. When the aircraft dispersed after the mission, they carried back more than logbooks and photographs. They brought evidence that one flight could redefine what humanity understood as possible. If anything goes wrong, we won't be the first to see the flash, Captain William Parsons whispered as he climbed into the cramped nose compartment. Early morning, August 6th. The B-29 Enola Gay was already at altitude, engines humming in unison. Silence filled the rear of the plane. In the nose, men were preparing to do what no one had ever done before. They assembled the bomb in midair. Not in a hangar, not on the ground, but at several thousand feet. It sounds insane, and that was the point. Why in the air? The reason was simple and terrifying. Little boy could not be kept fully assembled on the ground. Too great a risk, a stray spark, a static discharge, a mechanical fault, and Tinian would have been a crater. So the crucial steps were carried out in flight. A decision that endangered not just the mission, but the men who flew it. At the controls sat Tibbets, mission commander. In the narrow, stifling nose bay were two men, Captain William Deke Parsons and his assistant, Lieutenant Morris Jepson. They were not just servicemen. Parsons was a physicist, one of the designers of the arming system, a man who knew the bomb down to the last screw. Jepson was a young engineer, eyes and hands for the operation. Their task, mid-flight, to turn a metal cylinder into a nuclear weapon. When the bomber left Tinian and set course for Japan, Parsons gave the short order, begin assembly. Jepson removed panels and checked safeties. Outside, the deafening roar of engines. Inside, the dull clicks of tools. Every action was logged. Every step was a double-check procedure with no margin for error. Lights came alive on the console. Timers engaged, radio altimeters ready. In a breath, little boy moved from cargo to arm device. For the crew, it was simply another mission step. For Parsons, it was the moment science and war merged. He later recalled, "We weren't thinking philosophy. We were thinking currents, contacts, and height of detonation." Outside the plane, the sun rose. Below, clouds, and beneath them, Hiroshima. The mechanism was armed. Now everything depended on a few switches and the math of a flight path. Years later, Jepson would say, "I knew we were making history. I didn't then understand at what price." Perhaps that is the clearest way to describe that morning. Precision engineering pushed to its limit, and a hush of human voices before a world was changed forever. The seconds between aiming and flash lasted only moments. Yet in those moments, the entire calculus of destruction was contained. Altitude, speed, angle, and a final human decision. What the pilot saw through the windshield, the navigator etched into his private map. Lines of roads, the glitter of rivers, and then the sky unraveling into fire. The flight toward the target had become routine, but the final sequence, from bomb bay doors opening to the actual detonation, was a precise, rehearsed ritual. Describing it, we must hold two perspectives: the technical clarity of the procedures and the human view from the cockpit and instrument bays. Approach and visual identification. At the prescribed bombing altitude, the bombardier rechecked visual markers: river, bridges, rail junction, city blocks. Radio silence was maintained. Exchanges occurred through prearranged visual codes and signals. The release decision rested on the bombardier's visual certainty. If the target was obscured by cloud, contingency instructions applied. For Hiroshima, visibility was acceptable. Landmarks were located and confirmed. Opening and preparing for release. On command, the mechanical sequence began. Bomb bay doors opened, final control contacts were checked in the cargo bay, and readiness lights came on. The bombardier took his position at the site, a Norden-style optical system, and synchronized his countdown with the pilot and the weaponeer. Everyone knew their markers and signals. The trigger for the bombardier. Formally, the code was simple: visual confirmation by the bombardier, confirmation by the aircraft commander, release authorization. It might be a brief verbal cue over a closed channel or a prearranged gesture. Crucially, the bombardier had authority to make the final call, his eye and his sighting were the last checks before release. Mechanisms and bringing the device to armed condition. Little Boy had already been assembled and partially armed. Final electrical circuits and interlocks were completed in flight. Final contact checks were performed before arming. The detonation altitude was calculated at roughly 1,900 feet above ground, chosen to maximize blast area effects while limiting local fallout in the epicenter. The instrument suite, radio altimeters, and backup barometric sensors was set to command firing at the prescribed point. Release and the bombs fall. On the bombardier's signal, the release mechanism unlocked. Little Boy Asterisk left the bay and began its fall. The device's flight lasted only seconds. During descent, the engineer components moved and engaged the final weapon geometry. For the gun-type Little Boy Asterisk, the critical action was the assembly of two subcritical masses into a supercritical configuration, a kinetic process occurring in mid-flight rather than through a delayed timer. The mechanism ensured the correct alignment and timing of the projectile assembly. Observations from the Great RT Star. The instrumentation plane recorded everything. The light flash, the instant the shock wave reached the observation aircraft, millisecond pressure profiles, and the duration of the thermal pulse. Instruments logged the timeline in fine resolution. The flash, the shock arrival at escort planes, and changes in optical and radiation signatures. Those recordings became the primary scientific data for assessing weapon effects. Observers on the photo and instrument planes described the sequence. An instantaneous white bloom, a mushroom cloud forming, and within seconds a ring of the shock wave racing along the surface. Tibbets, the pilot, saw the target through the windscreen as a point around which streets and rivers seemed to constrict. His job: maintain heading, steady the aircraft, and give the bombardier a stable platform. For him, the release was technical. Footsteps on pedals, a hold on course, instrument monitoring. Yet emotionally, it marked the point of no return. Once the aircraft left the release line, there was no going back. The navigator bent over his charts, traced courses with a dry pen, and counted seconds in his head. He watched rivers dissolve into thin lines and houses reduced to geometric shapes. In that instant, his mind ran not with maps, but with a film, flash, then shadow, and people dropped out of their daily rhythm. He remembered the walk home from childhood, lamplights on a familiar street, and understood that those lights would now burn differently. When the bomb fell, his heartbeat skipped. Then the routine exchanges of confirmation took over, and the aircraft banked away from the point that, seconds earlier, had decided a new chapter in history. Minutes later, instruments would return numbers, photographs would yield frames, and reports would record timings. But for those in the cockpit, it was not merely measurement. It was an act that divided time into before and after, counted in seconds and seen with their own eyes. Target accomplished. Returning home. A short radio message. Just a few words, followed by silence. Morning, August 6th, 1945. Enola Gay Asterisk turned south, leaving behind a rising column of fire and ash. For the crew, the mission was complete. For command, a new phase was beginning, assessing what no one had ever assessed before. While Enola Gay Asterisk was on its way back to Tinian, fragments of radio reports and observations began streaming into the main communication hub. The escort planes, the Great Artiste Asterisk, and the photo recon aircraft, Necessary Evil Asterisk, were already transmitting data, pressure readings, burst altitude, flash temperature, and the first aerial photos. Each number was received with cold precision. Detonation height, roughly 600 meters. Fire radius, over a mile. Yield, confirmed as calculated. But behind those numbers, there was not yet an understanding of scale. At headquarters, they didn't see a city, only graphs and columns of data. Hours later came the first photographs. Aerial images where the center of Hiroshima had simply vanished. Only a gray, uneven scar remained where the city once stood. Officers on Tinian watched in silence. One later wrote, "We didn't understand what it meant. We just logged the result." The lead analyst recorded in his report. The bomb functioned as designed. Detonation normal. Radius of destruction exceeds forecast. A cold sentence that hid the end of tens of thousands of lives. For the military, success was measured in figures. Shockwave reached expected radius. City Hall destroyed. Industrial sector eliminated. Communications paralyzed. For the politicians in Washington, success looked different, a signal to the enemy, and the beginning of the end of the war. But in the reports from that day, not a single word mentioned people. Only phrases like result satisfactory, secondary target, on reserve. Enola Gay asterisk returned to base 12 hours after takeoff. No fanfare greeted it. Colonel Tibbets filed a brief report. Bomb released at 8:15, detonation visually confirmed. The crew was offered breakfast and told to rest. Film reels and instrument data were immediately confiscated for command analysis. They became the first scientific proof that nuclear weapons worked. Later, when specialists reviewed the documentation, someone noticed there wasn't a trace of emotion in any of it, as if it had all been a controlled experiment. Only years later did participants admit in interviews, "We spoke in formulas because we had no other words." The first blast answered some questions and raised many more. By that same night, a cold arithmetic began to appear over the commander's maps. Would one strike be enough to end the war, or would the experiment need repeating, raising the stakes and accelerating the post-war order? As reports from Tinian and photographs from Hiroshima filtered into staff rooms, emergency consultations replaced moral rhetoric with pragmatic calculation. How much had the first strike degraded Japan's will and ability to continue fighting? And what would be required next to bring Tokyo to unconditional surrender without a ground invasion? Attention focused on three questions. How many more detonations would be needed? Where was the next device? And could the United States deliver a series of strikes before Soviet forces significantly expanded their influence in Asia? Military estimates considered several factors at once. First, Japan's remaining war-fighting capacity after the strike, the operability of headquarters, rail hubs, shipyards, and communications. Second, the psychological effect. Would the ruling elite, the emperor, and the high command be cowed into surrender? Third, logistics and tempo. The strikes needed to be repeatable and rapid, not a one-time miracle. Logistics answered practical questions. Where was Fat Man asterisk, in what state, and how quickly could it be readied? On Tinian, plutonium components for an implosion device were in the flow of final assembly and testing. Fat Man asterisk required a different, more complex set of steps than Little Boy Star. Teams of weaponeers and technicians worked at relentless pace, testing firing trains, balancing assemblies, and checking detonators. In practical terms, a second bomb was being prepared, but not instantly. It required time and resources. For headquarters, this meant if a second device could be airborne within hours, pressure on Tokyo would intensify. If preparation took days, political time would favor the Soviets. The political dimension was crucial. In Washington and at Potsdam, Truman and his advisors debated the diplomatic effect of a second strike on America's post-war position. Some saw one bomb as a demonstration of power and a second as proof of resolve, a way to close the issue before Moscow consolidated gains. Others warned that repeated use would deepen the moral controversy and provoke international censure, weakening America's post-war legitimacy. Practical plans included operational details, alternate flight routes, reserve targets if smoke or clouds obscured visibility, crew rotations, and fuel calculations. Command asked for readiness on short notice. The possibility of delivering and releasing a follow-up weapon within 4,872 hours was discussed as a real objective, if logistics and weather permitted. Finally, the Soviet factor loomed large. A Soviet declaration of war and a rapid advance into Manchuria could reshape Asia's post-war map. For American strategists, demonstrating capability before Moscow could translate territorial gains into leverage was essential. That political pressure added weight to arguments for planning rapid subsequent strikes. By morning, the arithmetic was clear. One bomb had proven its destructive effect, but to secure the strategic goal, immediate surrender without invasion, a second action was being planned. The remaining question was operational. Who would fly Fat Man Asterisk? And could the bomber cruise again turn readiness into history within 3 days? 2 bombs, 2 principles of force. One a rifle, the other a sculptor compressing a core to its limit. Little boy Asterisk struck with simplicity. Fat Man Asterisk relied on complexity, where thousands of simultaneous impulses had to perform a synchronized symphony of destruction. One mistake in that quiet score, and the experiment could have become a catastrophe. If Little Boy Asterisk was a gun-type device, where energy comes from a relatively straightforward collision of masses, Fat Man Asterisk belonged to a different category altogether: implosion. A plutonium implosion weapon demanded not merely an impact, but a precise, symmetric compression of the core to supercritical density. That meant an even inward push from all sides, and for that you needed carefully engineered explosive systems and perfect timing. Imagine a workshop, not one charge, but many, each like a musician in an orchestra. The task was for all to play together at the exact instant. Any discordance would be a sour note. Technically, the key differences, broadly, without blueprints or recipes, were mechanism. Little Boy Asterisk delivered 2 subcritical masses into a single assembly. Fat Man Asterisk used external compression, implosion, to raise plutonium's density to criticality. Mechanical complexity. The implosion design required layered explosive elements, shaped explosive lenses that formed the correct shockwave, specialized detonators, and a reliable initiator system. It was far more technologically demanding than a gun type. Synchronization requirements. Implosion demanded that detonators around the device fire practically simultaneously with microsecond precision. Even small timing errors led to asymmetric compression and loss of yield. Control over timing and detonator agreement was therefore critical. The initiator. A neutron pulse had to be injected at the moment of maximum compression. The initiator, to guarantee a prompt chain reaction. Who was responsible for readiness? 2 lines converged: scientific engineering and operational military. Scientists at Los Alamos coordinated designs and explosive systems. In hands-on implementation, explosives teams led by specialists, including figures from Explosives Division, worked on shaping the shock. Operational responsibility for preparation and delivery rested with the weaponeers on Tinian. Officers like William Deek Parsons and his team, who performed final assembly, tested mechanisms, and coordinated in-flight arming. It was a coupling of science and discipline. Scientists designed the ideal symmetry. The military ensured that symmetry survived transport, hangar handling, and flight. Testing and calibration added another layer of difficulty. Unlike the relatively straightforward gun type, the implosion scheme required numerous trials, timing calibrations, and lens tests, many conducted at Los Alamos ranges and test stands. That is why preparing Fat Man Asterisk took more time and resources. It demanded high-confidence synchronization, exhaustive checks, and meticulous documentation for every operation. Finally, the psychological tone of preparation differed. Little Boy Asterisk offered relative mechanical certainty. Fat Man Asterisk implied constant readiness for the unexpected and required exceptional focus and discipline from those who handled it. When Fat Man Asterisk was brought to operational readiness, it stood as a triumph of engineering precision, and as a moment when humanity felt the price of its new power. The device's complexity meant its consequences were deeper than brute force. It was the apex of scientific achievement, turned into a historical inflection point. If the sun had come out just a few minutes earlier, history might have been different. August 9th, 1945. B-29 Boxcar Asterisk, carrying the Fat Man Asterisk bomb, takes off from Tinian Island. Commander, Major Charles Sweeney. His mission, strike Kakura, an industrial city filled with munitions plants. But ahead lies a day where every decision balances between orders and fuel, between weather and the fate of tens of thousands. At takeoff, everything went according to plan. The aircraft lifted off overloaded, carrying the massive weight of Fat Man Asterisk and extra fuel tanks. But within minutes, the crew noticed a problem. One of the fuel pumps wasn't working. A portion of the reserve tank became inaccessible. Sweeney calculated, "We have enough fuel if everything goes perfectly." Spoiler, it didn't. Hours later, Boxcar reached the rendezvous point over Iwo Jima. But one of the escort planes was late. The crew waited. Fuel burned away. Precious minutes and gallons lost. Sweeney made the call. Continue to Japan. Course, Kakura. But the city was shrouded in smoke from the earlier Yalta bombing and covered by morning haze. When Boxcar arrived over target, visibility was zero. Cloud, the ghost of Kakura. Sweeney made 3 passes. Each time, nothing but cloud and smoke. The navigator shouted, "I see only a roof of clouds." Photographers waited, the timer armed, but the sight never locked onto the target. As the bomber circled, fuel ran dangerously low. The choice was stark: bomb blind, violating direct orders from President Truman and Secretary Stimson, or find an alternate target. After a brief cockpit discussion, the decision was made. Kakura was off. The next target, Nagasaki. But the fuel situation was dire. By calculation, if they dropped the bomb and failed to find an airfield on the way back, they wouldn't make it. Sweeney took the risk. "We're not bringing this bomb home." Course set southwest. The crew silent. The radio hissed. As they neared Nagasaki, more clouds. Then, through a break, a glimpse. Just enough for the bombardier to lock onto Urakami Valley. The moment was seized. At 11:02 a.m., a blinding flash. A wave of heat and light engulfed the city. By then, Sweeney was already banking away, watching a second mushroom cloud rise behind them. Fuel gauges nearly empty. Boxcar limped toward Okinawa, one engine failing. The aircraft touched down hard, skidding across the runway, barely stopping before the sand. Fuel remaining, 7 minutes of flight time. Later, analysts would write, Nagasaki became the target not by plan, but by weather. The clouds over Kakura saved one city and doomed another. A detail trivial to military logic, yet one of the most haunting twists in 20th century history. One fuel pump, a few minutes of waiting, and the world changed course. The flash over Nagasaki wasn't just brighter or dimmer. It spoke to the earth differently. Where Hiroshima's blast rippled evenly across the plains, Nagasaki answered with echoes between its hills. The land itself became part of the detonation, a silent accomplice that shaped the outcome. Not worse, not better, simply different. The technical parameters of the mission were sterile numbers that turned into maps of death that day. Fat Man yielded roughly 21 kilotons of TNT, detonating at about 1,539 feet, 469 meters, above the ground. Those values defined the geometry of destruction. The yield determined the radius of total and partial ruin. The altitude set how the shockwave and heat pulse spread through the air. But the earth beneath decided how that energy would behave in real space, through terrain, density, and elevation. Nagasaki was a city of contours, steep hills, narrow valleys, deep basins. Ground zero lay above the Urakami Valley, a natural bowl surrounded by ridges. That bowl acted like an acoustic chamber, trapping and reflecting the blast wave. Instead of a perfect circle, destruction folded inward along the valleys. Whole neighborhoods vanished as pressure and fire surged down the slopes, concentrating force into narrow corridors of annihilation. Picture a single street lying in a hollow between two hills. The pressure there was as if the earth itself had clenched its fists. It's what made Nagasaki's devastation intense, but uneven. Unlike Hiroshima's open plain, with a blast spread in a smooth radial pattern, Nagasaki's landscape fragmented the wave. Some districts, shielded by ridges, survived almost intact. Others, just blocks away, were erased completely. The heat pulse and fires followed the same law of terrain. In low areas, the wind trapped burning vortices, firestorms feeding on oxygen until nothing remained. Where slopes acted as barriers, heat and smoke lingered, baking the ground and prolonging the agony of flames. Reflected shock waves reinforced pressure in narrow gaps, amplifying destruction where the models on paper had predicted less. Sometimes the difference between survival and extinction was one street or one hill. Geography decided who lived and who didn't. Comparing the two bombs isn't about scale, but about form. Fat Man's yield was greater than Little Boy's asterisk, 15 kt. Yet Nagasaki's mosaic of hills made the pattern of devastation patchwork, clusters of utter ruin beside untouched enclaves. For military analysts, this made assessment difficult. Damage didn't follow neat circles, but meandered along valleys and slopes, demanding detailed mapping block by block. In those irregular patterns, analysts glimpsed something profound. Human landscapes aren't flat models. Energy met matter like a brush meeting canvas, shaped by the texture beneath. The result was far less predictable and far more haunting than any calculation. When the first reconnaissance teams entered the valleys and began charting the wreckage, they didn't see rings of destruction. They saw mosaics, fragments of light and shadow, and within them, the uneasy realization that nature itself had rewritten the geometry of war. In war, decisions are made in seconds, but their echoes last for decades. Years later, when the men who held the controls began to speak, their words carried both precision and conscience. Some still spoke the language of coordinates and orders. Others, the language of sleepless nights and questions no manual could answer. After the war, the crews of Enola Gay Asterisk and Boxcar became symbols of a new age, but each lived that legacy differently. At first, there were reports, dry, technical, written in the tone of military documentation, draw parameters, wind direction, impact results. Those documents were meant for archives and historians. But as years passed, memoirs and interviews began to reveal what official records had erased: doubt, rationalization, pride, and sometimes silence. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of Enola Gay Asterisk, remained the man of duty. His later comments sounded like debriefings stripped of emotion. I felt no joy, no regret. We had a mission to end the war. We did it. He emphasized precision, coordination, and execution. When asked if he felt remorse, Tibbets always replied, "If we hadn't done it, someone else would have, and worse. I saved lives, I didn't take them." His words embodied the military generation shaped by necessity and obedience. Major Charles Sweeney, commander of Boxcar Asterisk, spoke more carefully. His memoirs carried pride in his crew and weariness from the burden of command. We flew to complete a mission, not to pass judgment. But over Nagasaki, I realized history was no longer in our hands. He often returned to technical details: the failed fuel pump, the smoke over Kokura, the near-empty tanks at landing. Those details became his way of explaining that the choice of target was not moral, but circumstantial. We didn't choose Nagasaki. The fuel chose for us, he said in a 1980s interview. Robert Lewis, Enola Gay's Asterisk co-pilot, left perhaps the most human response, one that the press would quote endlessly. "My God, what have we done?" He wrote those words in flight, seconds after the explosion, in the mission logbook. Years later, he admitted he couldn't stop replaying that moment in his mind. "I knew it was war, but I also saw a light no man should ever see." His later interviews swung between justification and trauma, between necessity and the unbearable realization of what that light had meant. Others, like weaponeer William Parsons, navigator Theodore Van Kirk, and radar officer Jacob Baser, kept their tone analytical. "It was an experiment, and it worked exactly as planned," said Baser. To them, precision mattered more than philosophy. Yet even in their words lingered the understanding that success meant crossing a line humanity could never uncross. Between the lines of their logs and testimonies lived the same paradox. As if two people had sat in the cockpit, one recording numbers, the other silently watching history ignite outside the window. Operationally, the missions were flawless, perfect coordination, perfect execution. Historians called them triumphs of discipline. But the human record told another story. Those who spoke in coordinates in 1945 spoke in contradictions by 1960. None could truly define where duty ended and guilt began. When these aging pilots sat down for interviews decades later, their hands no longer held the yoke, but they still trembled with the memory of that morning. The official reports remain in archives. Their personal ones live in the pauses between words, where precision gives way to the quiet, unanswerable why. Every map, every number, every report once belonged to living streets. To grasp the scale, you don't need to multiply megatons. You only need to hear how a morning sounds before the sky learns it's about to change forever. Hiroshima, the morning before the light. A woman named Eiko woke earlier than usual. The heat wouldn't let her sleep. Her house stood by the Motoyasa River, across from a tram stop. She pulled a letter from under her pillow, one from her husband serving in the South, and reread the line. "Take care of the garden. When I return, I want to see your lilies bloom." The sun was already catching on the water as school children crossed the bridge, blue satchels, identical steps. In the distance, the faint hum of an aircraft. She thought it was a scout plane and, as always, didn't go to the shelter. She put on the kettle. When the sky suddenly flared, the sound struck her chest and then vanished. A moment later, the wind tore the curtain from the wall, and the room turned white, washed from the inside out. She didn't know she was looking at the beginning of a new age. Years later, Eiko would write, "I never heard the explosion, only the silence that remained forever." Nagasaki, the day the city breathed smoke. A young man named Kenzo, a trade school student, was helping his father at the shipyard that morning. He loved the smell of oil and metal, dreaming that after the war he'd build ships of his own. When the siren wailed, his father waved it off, another drill. "Keep working." They stood together at the open hangar. Then, over the valley, a silver plane flickered, tiny, almost beautiful. The next second, the sky folded inward, and Kenzo had time only to cover his face. The blast wasn't loud, it was complete. Light and dust became one. Later he woke on a hillside, warm, dry air rushing past. The city below was invisible, only gray swirls and the glint of metal like water. That night, Kenzo wrote in his notebook, "We survived, but the city became a reflection without a mirror." These two voices are the other side of the reports. Where the military saw radii and kilotons, people remembered sounds, smells, and the brief moments that divided life into before and after. If the numbers tell how much was destroyed, the human words tell what was lost. It began as an operation, with routes, calculations, and altitude charts. But it ended as an equation whose variables no longer dealt with coordinates. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became more than points on a map. They became an unresolved formula where military precision collided with human meaning. From the standpoint of military science, the H mission and N mission marked the threshold of technological warfare. They weren't simply bombing runs, they were planetary experiments. Analysts drew 3 enduring lessons. Lesson 1, precision and the limits of control. The B-29 missions revealed both the power and fragility of manual targeting. Cloud cover over Kakura, shifting wind currents, visual misreadings, all prove that success could no longer rely on luck. This drove the evolution of radio and radar guidance, automatic targeting, and weather satellites. From then on, precision itself became a strategic weapon. Lesson 2, reliability and system redundancy. The failed fuel pump on Boxcar became a textbook case. One mechanical fault nearly rewrote history. After the war, U.S. Command concluded that true military power lay not only in strength but in predictability. From that came modern nuclear safety protocols, layered interlocks, redundant circuits, and human factor safeguards. Lesson 3, intelligence as the new battlefield. Data from the great artiste, photographs from necessary evil, weather observations, and radio logs. These became the first foundations of information warfare. Victory would no longer depend on numbers, but on knowledge. From these lessons emerged reconnaissance systems, satellite surveillance, and, eventually, the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, To know first was to survive. These three lessons formed the grammar of the atomic age: precision, reliability, control. But they also birthed a new, unwritten discipline: conscience. The political consequences moved in parallel. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't just end World War II. They rebooted the very idea of war itself. Military power was no longer measured in tanks or divisions, but in the ability to erase cities with a single act. Thus began the nuclear strategy, the doctrine of deterrence, the balance of fear, the race for parity. The Manhattan Project became the blueprint for a permanent atomic infrastructure. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its own bomb, and the world entered a new age, one where every laboratory and hangar became part of a global equation of power. For engineers and soldiers, it was an age of contradiction. They took pride in technical mastery, yet carried the knowledge that precision now measured death as accurately as success. Many from the Manhattan Project would later admit they sought to prove what was possible without asking what it meant. From that realization emerged a new kind of figure: the engineer with a conscience asterisk, a person who understood that equations could carry both strength and guilt. Hiroshima and Nagasaki taught the military how to plan, the engineers how to perfect, and the politicians how to deter. But they taught no one how to live with the understanding that anything was now possible. In the nuclear age, responsibility ceased to be a rank. It became a personal constant, the sum of knowledge and choice multiplied by consequence. In that equation, there were no victors, only those who realized that precision without morality becomes the perfect mistake. The operation ended, but an era began. An era where neither commanders nor scientists could hide behind orders. A world where every button became not just a tool, but a question of conscience. And perhaps that is the final lesson from those who first looked upon the sunrise of the atomic age.